Hello, my name is Debbie Doyle. I'm the meetings manager here at the American Historical Association. Thank you for attending our session called Our Country is Full, Roots and Consequences of America's 1921 Immigration Act 100 Years Later, which is part of the AHA Colloquium series of virtual AHA. This session is joint with two of our AHA affiliates, the Immigration and Ethnic History Society and the Committee on LGBT History. We're excited to have you join us and are looking forward to a productive discussion. I would like to thank our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. You can support virtual AHA and other AHA activities by joining the AHA, or if you're already a member, making a donation today. We'll post links with details in the chat toward the end of the session. A few logistical things to consider before we start the webinar. By registering for or participating in the AHA's webinars, participants and panelists agree to abide by the AHA's Code of Professional Conduct. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions to the presenters. We hope to address all relevant questions, but need to be mindful of the time, so we may paraphrase or combine questions. If you'd like to be a part of the conversation on social media, remember to use the virtual AHA hashtag. Finally, a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded and we'll share the recording on YouTube after the session. I'd now like to turn things over to the chair of today's webinar, Erika from the University of Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Thank you, Victor. Thank you to the AHA for adapting so quickly and allowing us to still gather together, even if it's virtually. I'm so pleased to be able to chair and to moderate our conversation this afternoon. We are coming to you to talk about immigration, an issue that's perennially in the news, but especially so in these past few weeks in the opening of the Biden administration. But we're going to talk about 100 years ago, when Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, and then 3 years later, the 1924 Immigration Act. Together, both of these laws inaugurated an unprecedented era of immigration restriction, unprecedented until our past 4 years under the Trump administration. These laws further legitimized discrimination on the basis of race and national origin and sexual orientation in US immigration law. And it also established the national origins quota system, which remained in place for over 40 years. These immigration laws not only transformed immigration to the United States, but they also impacted immigration regulation globally. Many countries passed similar laws in the wake of this US legislation. Most famously, Adolf Hitler praised the laws as a racial model for Nazi Germany. 100 years later, White House senior advisor Stephen Miller praised them again as he helped to guide the Trump administration towards an assault on nearly every type of immigration into the United States. So on this 100th anniversary of this landmark piece of legislation, this panel brings together a wide range of expert historians to explore both the roots as well as the long-lasting consequences of the immigration system created by both the 1921 and the 1924 Immigration Acts. We will end by having a Q&A with all of you, hopefully connecting the presentations to global consequences, as well as this current moment of change as President Biden seeks to undo many of the immigration policies put in place by his predecessor. I'm going to introduce each one of our speakers in turn as they begin to present their papers, but I'll preview our panel with very brief remarks. Professor Linda Gordon will be examining the ways in which the KKK, white supremacy, and white supremacist-inspired definitions of American national identity shaped the 21 and 24 Immigration Acts. She'll be followed by Ashley Johnson Bavery, who will explore how undocumented immigration in Detroit, the epicenter for illegal immigration into the United States before World War II, helped to create the framework for America's contemporary immigration system. And Alexandra Minister will analyze how fears of quote unquote white extinction have influenced US immigration policies from the early 20th century to today. So I think we are going to start first with Professor Gordon, and I'll provide a longer introduction to her and her work. Professor Gordon is Professor of History and University Professor of the Humanities at New York University. Her early books focused on the historical roots of social policy issues, particularly as they concern gender and family issues. Her later books, she explored other genres of history. Her recent publications include The Great Arizona Orphan Abduction, 1999, and the biography of the great photographer Dorothea Lange in 2009, both of which won the Bancroft Prize for Best Book in US History. Impounded in 2008 was another one of her publications, Feminism Unpublished in 2015, The Second Coming of the KKK published in 2017, and her most recent book is another biography of a photographer, Inga Morath, an illustrated biography. Thank you so much for joining us, Linda.
Oh, thank you for having me, and thank you for the work, and I know it was work in putting this whole thing together. So I really appreciate, I'm going to learn a lot from listening to other people too. When the 1924 immigration bill passed by a landslide, the Ku Klux Klan took credit for creating the bill, for shepherding it through Congress, and they considered it a national validation of its views. Now, of course, it's true that nativist anti-immigration agitation had been a force for decades in America. And it's certainly true that the Johnson-Reed Act might well have passed without the Klan. And one of the reasons for that is that it's quite possible that the majority of white Protestant Americans shared some, if not all, of the Klan's point of views. But the Klan contributed to the act in two particular ways. First of all, it had been a major force in making its form of bigotry a hegemonic and respectable set of views in the United States, in its use of terms like, quote, 100% Americans or true Americans. It is discursively excluding its enemies from citizenship. And by the way, anticipating the way that McCarthyists used the term un-American 2 decades later to exclude people who had dissenting views. But secondly, very concretely, Klan spokesman Albert Johnson, chair of the House Committee on Immigration, was not only the co-author of the bill, but the person responsible for shepherding it through the Congress. Now, officially, the 1920s Klan was an extension and a revitalization of the original terrorist Southern Klan, but it was a very different beast. It was a primarily Northern movement. It was a mass movement with somewhere between 3 and 6 million members, including about 1.5 million women. Unlike the first Klan, it was not at all secret. It was part of an evangelical Protestant revival. And most importantly, its strategy was primarily electoral and propagandistic. In the main, it was nonviolent. It did engage in vigilantism, but that was not really central to what it was doing in its national victories. It remained fiercely racist against African Americans. And in the West, it extended that racism to other groups of color, notably Mexican, Japanese, Filipino, Chinese Americans. But its tremendous strength in the North came from demonizing Catholics and Jews. And it was that particular set of targets dominated its vast propaganda machine. Because of that, I'm going to use the term bigotry to talk about this rather than racism, because to many today, being Jewish or Catholic would seem to be more a religious matter rather than a racial matter. And as many historians know, those definitions were very, very fuzzy in the 1920s. Its electoral work was really impressive. It operated systematic get out the vote and lobbying campaigns, and as a result, it elected some 16 senators, scores of congressmen, 11 state governors, and thousands of state, county, and municipal officials. And these were politicians who ran openly as members or supporters of the Klan. Its propaganda machine was equally impressive. It included widespread showings of the film Birth of a Nation, hundreds of lecturers, some 150 print publications, 2 radio stations, and thousands, literally thousands, of evangelical ministers who praised that in sermons. The Klan actually bragged that it had 40,000 evangelical minister members, but I warn you, you shouldn't take any figures that come from the Klan as true. It also used big tent celebrity evangelicals such as Bob Jones, Billy Sunday, Amy Semple McPherson to preach in favor of and even encourage people to join the Klan. In fact, it's not just that the Klan contributed to an evangelical revival. In some ways, it was an evangelical revival. And I would argue that it played a role, a long-term role in making white evangelicals more bigoted. Now, anti-immigration agitation then and now depends on building fear and doing that particularly through allegations about conspiracies. And the Klan's allegations, I have to say, were not necessarily more wacky than those of the earlier nativists or than those we hear today. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. For example, Catholic immigrants came to America not because of poverty, but because they were sent by the Pope with instructions to live incognito underground like espionage moles until the Pope gave the order for the coup that was going to establish the United States of Catholic America. Another one, Jews ran Hollywood, not only because they were avaricious, that's of course the classical libel against Jews, but because they used the movies deliberately to subvert the morals of American women through racy images and plots. Although the Klan did not emphasize these measures of intelligence that the elite nativists did, it deployed other statistics that were equally invented, as for example, charging that 62% of all America's politicians and 90% of all America's police were Catholic, and that school teachers were overwhelmingly Catholic because they sought to brainwash their students into popery. Behind that fear-mongering was a premise that only a homogeneous nation could be stable and successful, and that diversity by its nature weakened the nation. I'm just going to do a short quote from Albert Johnson of the Johnson-Reed Act. Today, instead of a nation descended from generations of free men bred to a knowledge of the principles and practice of self-government, we have a heterogeneous population, no small proportion of which is sprung from races that throughout the centuries have known no liberty. Our capacity to maintain our cherished institutions stands diluted by a stream of alien blood. In this discourse, Catholics, Jews, Asians, Mexicans were not free men because they were subservient to foreign rulers. In the case of Catholics, it's because they take orders from the Pope. In the case of Jews, it is because of this alleged international cabal of financiers made famous in the famed forgery called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They owed their allegiance to both of them to international rather than national governments. The Klan alleged that, quote, Mongolians, a name it often used for Asians, simply could not amalgamate with Americans. And in a very uncanny premonition of US government claims in World War II, it argued that Asian immigrants' loyalty always remained with their country of origin. They were even aware of Japan's rise as an economic and military power, and Klan propaganda represented the Japanese, and I quote, as a threatening vanguard of a rising nation intent on subverting communities. Now, Klan lobbying succeeded in making politicians reluctant to vote against its interests because of fears of its, quote, base, as we have heard Trump supporters today. Supporting this lobbying was very sophisticated research about the political leanings of congressmen. He produced a chart detailing where each senator stood in relation to the Klan's views. Whether the congressional manager, Albert Johnson, of this bill was an actual member is immaterial, because his congressional opponents always labeled him a tool of the Klan. His background fit him very well for this job. He'd been in Congress since 1914. He was elected on an anti-immigration platform. He was an outspoken anti-Semite and Mason. He was an experienced anti-immigrant activist in the Pacific Northwest. He had joined earlier vigilante actions against the IWW, the left-wing union that was strong, particularly among loggers and also in canneries in the Pacific Northwest. He bragged about participating in the mob that forced hundreds of South Asians out of Bellingham, Washington in 1907. During the mass deportation of political dissidents in 1919 after the First World War, he was then chairman of the Immigration and Naturalization Committee, and he showed a flair for dramatic stunts. He accompanied the deportees on a trip from Ellis Island to the Brooklyn waterfront, where they were then marched onto an old troop ship, the Buford, to be returned to Europe. And accompanying him on this stunt was J. Edgar Hoover, then head of the Department of Justice's new radical division. Now, when the second Klan shrank, and it shrank precipitously in the mid-1920s, its ideology found other organizational channels. In fact, I think it's important to remember that there's no evidence that the Klan shrank because of any widespread revulsion against its views. It shrank rather because of increasing evidence of the corruption and criminality of its leaders. And I might point out that the 2020s Klan was a for-profit corporation, which was, many of its members said it does nothing but ask us for more money. So it's not surprising that many ex-Klansmen, or even people who are still members of the Klan, moved in the 1930s into American Nazi groups or American fascist groups. There were many of these groups, probably over 100. Their combined membership was probably in the hundreds of thousands, though nowhere near the millions that belonged to the Klan. This shift to the fascist groups was a major strategic change for two reasons. The first was that the fascist groups could be extremely violent, as the Klan was on the whole not. The second was another very interesting long-term shift in American history, and that is the decline of anti-Catholicism. In fact, the 20s Klan probably went on more about Catholics than they did about Jews. What's fascinating is how many of them became ardent followers of the radio star Father Charles Coughlin, who was a Catholic. In deserting this earlier anti-Catholicism, the Klan shift joined a general decline of that prejudice, but it also illustrated, I think, its extraordinary opportunism and finding enemies and being willing to use whatever enemies it thought it could have traction with. in deserting the anti-Catholicism, the Klan shifted toward overweening anti-Semitism, and generally speaking, anti-Semitism plus racism against people of color was the common denominator among all of these American fascist groups. They were in the fact that there were many small ones and that they didn't all try to unite or even agree with each other. They are actually a little bit reminiscent, or maybe that's the wrong term, of today's white nationalists, who are also a series of many, many small groups. Now, Coughlin established, for example, an organization called the Christian Front. This is the name he took from Spain's Generalissimo Franco. It was a Christian front established as against the Popular Front, which was, of course, the union of communists, socialists, and many liberals supporting the New Deal. The Christian Front, ironically for that name, was probably one of the most violent of the groups. One New York City observer referred, and I'm quoting, to its relentless month-long campaign of physical intimidation, beatings, and slashings that probably warrant the name pogrom. In Boston, Jews were attacked on the streets and in parks, some stabbed and disfigured, and some girls having their clothes ripped off. Another group, the Black Legion, which was strong in Detroit, had a different twist because it was very, very close to the Ford Motor Company and the General Motors Company in trying to beat back the union organizing campaigns that were going on among auto workers at that time. The Black Legion, as it was called in Detroit, created what it called terror bands. It committed arsons, bombing, murders, floggings, and once planned, luckily they were caught, they planned to release cyanide gas in local synagogues. Viewing the range and intensity of this violence, the Associated Press wrote of, quote, a plot to establish a fascist dictatorship with 6 million armed men taking part in a coup. Now, these fascists may not seem directly related to earlier anti-immigrant policy, but I would argue otherwise. As several theorists have argued, law functions not only as an expression of public political opinion, but also as a creator of public political opinion. Law validates and even produces public opinion. So we need to see Johnson Reed not only as an effect of bigotry, but also as a cause of bigotry, continuing the Klan's work in making bigotry, in this case, official, but also respectable. So it should not be surprising that the closing off of immigration in 1924 did not produce a lull in bigotry, or at least not right away, but ultimately an escalation of it for at least another decade. In other words, I think we need to see immigration restriction not only as a policy, but as itself a force in escalating bigotry, just as today, anti-immigration politics not only expresses, but also spreads and intensifies racism. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Linda. Next on our panel is Professor Ashley Johnson Bavery. She is an assistant professor of history at Eastern Michigan University. Her research focuses on immigration and ethnicity, urban space, and foreign policy in 20th century America. She's the author of the just published book, yay, Bootlegged Aliens, Immigration Politics on America's Northern Border, published this year. It examines Detroit, Michigan, America's epicenter for undocumented immigration in the 1920s, to explore the origins of restrictive immigration policies and policing practices. Her work has also been published in the Journal of Urban History, Labor, Le Travail, and Reviews in American History. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Erika, and thank you so much, Linda, for your fascinating comments on the Ku Klux Klan. It really segues into some of the things that I'll be talking about. And thank you to the AHA for hosting this webinar and allowing us to do this virtually in a way that we might not have imagined last year this time. Okay, so I'll just start talking a little bit. I have some photographs to share, mostly maps, and a couple of photographs, which I'll do and share my screen when they come up and are relevant. So we know that the 1924 Immigration Act established the US Border Patrol, or many of you may know that, which is an organization that has spent the last 8 or 9 decades profiling and racializing immigrants on the US border with Mexico. There's a robust literature on how this federal police force worked on the border. Our co-panelist, Alexandra Minister, has contributed to this, as well as Kelly Lytle Hernandez. But what I want to emphasize today is the fact that the Border Patrol began with a huge focus on policing the northern border. And in its first decade, the organization was deeply unpopular with many Americans and looked like it might be dismantled. But once established, it's incredibly hard to do away with policing or enforcement agents, particularly once they have framed themselves as defenders of the American state and the public welfare. So, and this has echoes today. So I'll discuss how in the mid-1920s, local and international challenge to the federal border enforcement on the US-Canada border launched this debate over who should police America's boundaries, which actually calls into question the need for a federal land border at all. So the 1921 Immigration Act led to the 1924 Immigration Act, of course, which provided for the formation of the United States Border Patrol, a military-like force that spent its early years focusing on curbing immigrant smuggling on the US border with Canada. And a smuggling industry has long helped Chinese and other excluded immigrants across the northern border. But after the 1924 Immigration Act, smuggling increased dramatically. And Canada had passed its own exclusionary immigration laws, as Erika mentioned in her intro, in 1923, which favored Northern Europeans, but it made an exception for farm laborers and other domestic workers as well. So many Southern Eastern Europeans declared their intention to work on the farms of Saskatchewan in particular and Alberta in Canada, and then stayed in larger Canadian cities. There was no enforcement apparatus that kept them to their word, so they had to go to these farms. So many made their way to US border towns. So I'll share my screen here to show you where some of these, so here we see on this map, along here, we see Detroit, Michigan, which transformed into the epicenter of the smuggling industry at this time, followed closely by the Buffalo and Niagara Falls regions of New York. And in Detroit, particularly Poles, Hungarians, Greeks, and Russians found work at automobile companies such as Ford, Dodge, and Packard. While in Buffalo, thousands of Italians, Poles, and other Eastern Europeans crowded into established ethnic neighborhoods and labored in grain, steel, and lumber mills. On a smaller scale, the towns along the St. Lawrence River, here we see Massena, New York, in New York became popular spots for excluded Europeans to cross into the United States. And smugglers organized bands of rowboats and took handfuls of aliens or immigrants across the St. Lawrence River at this time, where on the American side, taxis were often waiting or cars were waiting to shuttle them to the nearest train station at Massena. And from this tiny upstate New York border town and other towns along here, smuggled Europeans bought one-way tickets to Manhattan, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and other major cities. So these cities were really the gateway into many industrial and major centers in the United States. so the urban core of the Northeast and the Midwest in the United States at this time. So to combat this problem, the 1924 Immigration Act, established the U.S. Border Patrol, which was an organization that tried to set forth a masculinist vision of tough state power, and but that in its early years really struggled. Here's the Border Patrol in Minna, New York, and on the right we have the Border Patrol in Detroit. You can see they're patrolling along the Detroit River, and here in Minna, New York, the Minna Border Patrol is patrolling along the St. Lawrence River as well. So civil service examination requirements meant that most of the early men were local mail carriers and received little training. And within 3 months, 25% of new recruits had resigned, citing demanding hours, harsh weather, and low pay as the main reasons for leaving the patrol. To save the civilian organization's kind of foundering reputation, immigration officials reinvented the force as this semi-military organization. They issued new uniforms. The first year of the force, they hadn't had uniforms. They issued these new military-like uniforms. And on the northern border, immigration officials regularly started to portray border patrolmen as quote unquote vigorous and assertive, words imbued with gendered connotations that suggested new police tactics fit with this tough new vision of federal power on the border. In 1927, the Commissioner of Immigration, Harry Hull, sent an annual report that called the Border Patrol a young man's organization demanding, quote, manhood, stamina, versatility, and resourcefulness in the highest degree. And the patrol also perpetuated a gender dichotomy that pitted independent patrolmen patrolling the border, going up and down these rivers, armed, for the deportation of immigrants who had become what they called dependent on the state. And so they pitted independent patrolmen against what they called dependent immigrants to legitimize their deportation. And they did this by overusing the likely to become a public charge clause, which allowed for the deportation of immigrants who had become dependent on the state in any way. In multiple border towns along the northern border, patrol agents purged sanatoriums, jails, and insane asylums of local non-citizens using this clause. And many of the people who were sent, some were Europeans, but many were Canadians sent back to Canada who were deported. And to justify these, they used gendered claims that the men in these groups, if they were men, had become dependent and therefore did not deserve to continue as American citizens, were unfit to become or live as residents in America. So local American and Canadian objections to federal law enforcement, however, threatened the patrol's claim to power. So we'll go back to this map here. So in the Northeast, in the far right, you see Houlton, Maine up here. So in Maine's northeastern border towns of Houlton, and then right nearby were the towns of Monticello and Madawaska. Border Patrol officers had begun barring Canadians who crossed the border each day to work in paper factories and potato fields. And they've been doing this for over a decade. And this prompted the town mayors to petition the Federal Commissioner of Immigration at Montreal for the removal of the Border Patrol altogether from the entire region. When patrolmen began pulling their firearms a little further west at border checkpoints in Newport, Vermont, locals unleashed an avalanche of criticism on the service. And in Detroit, locals complained over violence on the border as well in similar ways. Native American tribes situated on the border objected to the prospect of federal troops in a near reservation lands. And this was particularly true in Minnesota and in the Buffalo region in New York. And perhaps most dramatically, the patrol was questioned in 1929 when in this case of Henry Verkula, and this took place in International Falls, Minnesota, so up here on the left, right above his photo. And Henry Verkulla was a local confectioner who had gone over to Canada for the day to have a picnic with his family in the summer of 1929. And when he came back across the border through the immigration checkpoint, he failed to come to a complete halt. And the patrolman on call fired 26 shots into his car, killing Verkulla instantly. Local outrage highlighted the persisting wariness with which many Americans perceived the federal government and the Border Patrol's tenuous claim on authority in these regions. Just 10 days after the shooting, 200 citizens of International Falls signed a petition asking the Minnesota governor to retain local jurisdiction of the patrolman's case so that he would not just receive a slap on the wrist from federal authorities. And as news of the murder spread, thousands of citizens, many of them borderland residents of the northern border, wrote to President Hoover asking him to reform the Border Patrol and in some cases dissolve the organization altogether. Local criticism of the Border Patrol raised questions over the need for a military-like force in a region that was not actually at war. So afraid that the 1924 Act would prove toothless without federal enforcement, restrictionist policymakers in Washington, particularly Albert Johnson, launched an effort to merge the Border Patrol with the US military. And this was a move that drew international criticism, but it did shift the discussion over border policing from whether a federal patrol should have jurisdiction on America's borders to whether the established force should be made of civilian or military officers. That's where things change at this time. So in 1929, Representative Grant Hudson of Michigan introduced a bill that proposed to merge the US Border Patrol with the Coast Guard. And President Hoover backed the bill, and debates over its particulars focused extensively on the northern border. The reason the Coast Guard was chosen in the first place was that it had experience policing the Great Lakes, but opposition to the bill was fierce. And this was particularly from the Canadian government, and the bill ultimately did fail. So here we see just an example of a news clipping from the Canadian, the Winnipeg Tribune, that talks about the militarization, the prospective militarization of the northern border. And many Canadian newspapers and the Canadian government were very against this and thought that there should not be armed American troops on the US-Canada border. But what happens is that this proposal to merge the US Border Patrol with the Coast Guard did succeed in shifting the debate from whether the Border Patrol should exist at all to whether it should be an actual military organization. So when the Roosevelt administration took over in 1933, the new Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, made no secret of objecting to the previous administration's immigration policies, but it did not consider dismantling the Border Patrol. Instead, the Republican administration placed the patrol under the Immigration Service, which was the predecessor, of course, of the INS and ICE as well. And this ensured its survival as a federal organization. So ultimately, I'm going to close here, and ultimately, I want to talk about and show the unstable origins of the US Border Patrol, uncovering how local, federal, and international actors contributed to its establishment as a militarized civilian force that, of course, is integral to America's growing and emerging immigration apparatus at this time. But I also want to raise questions and thoughts about how once hardline immigration policies are put in place, it's extremely difficult to dismantle them. This is particularly true in the case of policing and immigration. So as early as the 1920s, we see a federal police force that was deeply unpopular in the places it patrolled, but that nonetheless consolidated power and kept it. And I want us to think about this as we have just come out of a presidential administration with extreme immigration policies. And we looked with cautious optimism in some cases toward a new administration, hoping that or expecting that dismantling of some of these immigration laws and rules and practices. But the past has shown us it's very difficult to dismantle institutions that are meant to maintain the power of the federal government at the border. So I'll end there, and we can talk more about some of these themes and consequences in the question and answer.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Our final paper is from Professor Alexandra Minister. She is the Carol Smith Rosenberg Collegiate Professor of American Culture, History and Women's and Gender Studies, and a Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Michigan. Most of her research has focused on the uses and misuses of genetics in the United States and Latin America. She's the author of the award-winning book, Eugenic Nation, Faults and Frontiers of Better Breeding in Modern America, as well as Telling Genes, the Story of Genetic Counseling in America, which was a Choice 2013 Outstanding Academic Title in Health Sciences. Her most recent book, and I should have pulled it up and showed it to you on camera, is Proud Boys and the White Ethno-State, How the Alt-Right is Warping the American Imagination, which came out in 2019. This book applies the lenses of historical analysis, feminist studies, and critical race studies to deconstruct the core ideas of the far right and white nationalism in the United States. Stern is also the PI of the Sterilization and Social Justice Lab, which uses mixed methods to study patterns and experiences of eugenic sterilization in the 20th century United States. And if you aren't already noticing in the chat box, we are putting links to bios, author and researcher bios, as well as links to books, and in this most recent case, also a link to the Sterilization and Social Justice Lab. So thank you and welcome, Alex.
Thank you so much, Erika, for that kind introduction. I'm now going to share my screen, hopefully with success. And all this clicking, we've become very good at it. And okay, off we go. So I'm really delighted to be part of this panel. I'd like to thank Erika and her colleague Maddalena Marinari for comments on this the paper from which this talk comes, and Linda and Ashley for sharing their work alongside mine and for this conversation today. And of course, we know all the work that goes on behind the scenes with the AHA organizers and staff. I'd like to mention that I will be showing images created by white nationalists and white supremacists in this fairly short PowerPoint that I have. I present these not to amplify their message, but to critically deconstruct and contextualize it. So what I'm going to be doing in my talk is really hopefully creating some stepping stones between 1921, 1924, and where we were in the 2010s, and to a great extent where we still are today, in terms of thinking about xenophobia and some of the ideological underpinnings of xenophobia. And these connections for me became quite striking when I began working on the book that Erika mentioned, Proud Boys in the White Ethno-State. I had been tracking the rise of a more and more kind of quote unquote alt-right groups online, and looking at both their memes and social media presence, as well as some of the books and more scholarly light publications that they were putting out. And one of these that I came across in 2016 was the centennial edition of Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race. Now, many of you are probably quite aware of this book. It was published in 1916 originally, and really made an argument that the Great Race was passing, in other words, becoming extinct, because of the arrival of new immigrants, most markedly Southern and Eastern European immigrants, as well as other immigrants, Asians and Latin Americans, into the United States. And what this book did was it used a lot of techniques of classifying and cartography to make arguments about white extinction and to foreground really this idea that demography is destiny, and to connect that to fears of white disappearance and white genocide. I will note that this book was, the centennial edition was published by a press called Austera Publications, which is a neo-pagan, neo-fascist press that does a lot of homeschooling books about kind of the great triumph of white civilization, as well as other books related to kind of neo-pagan and Volkish themes. So this appeared on my radar in the summer of 2016, and I became very interested in unpacking this and trying to understand the continuing relevance of Madison Grant to the white nationalism, and particularly its strong anti-immigrant sentiments. As I did further digging, I found out that Madison Grant was being celebrated across the white nationalist social media sphere. So I show you here 2 images. Some of you may be familiar with the site Countercurrents. It publishes a wide array of books and blog posts and so on and so forth, and really has become kind of one of the most important spaces for kind of white nationalist kind of thinking and ideology that hasn't been deplatformed because they actually own their own web space and can control it. But what they do every year is they celebrate Madison Grant, they celebrate Lothrop Stoddard, and they celebrate some of these earlier eugenicists and xenophobes from the 1910s and the 1920s. So without fail, you can find these homages to Madison Grant. I also then found a lengthy essay by Richard Spencer, and many of you are familiar with his name, although he's kind of fallen to the wayside, I would say, as a major kind of face of white nationalism in recent years. But in 2016, he was editing a journal called Radix Journal, and one of his longest pieces is a celebration of Madison Grant, and particularly underscoring Madison Grant's role in providing a framework for understanding demography and the threat to the quote unquote white race. So why and how did Madison Grant become rehabilitated, and what does that mean for us today? So in many ways, Madison Grant's anti-immigration screeds and his mapping, and you can see in one of the 4 images that this is one of the maps that he produced, which looks at present distribution of European races and divides them into the 3 categories that many of us are familiar with from that time period, specifically Nordics, Alpines, and Mediterraneans, which were basically judged to be more superior to much less from Nordics down to the Mediterraneans. But this map really spoke to a sense, it both reflected at the time kind of this focus on national origins and racial quotas, but provided a framework for thinking about demography and the body politique. And really, if we can draw a fairly continuous line between this type of thinking all the way into this kind of supposed theory of the quote, great replacement, end quote, which is an idea that was developed by the French thinker René Camus. Some of you may have even read the translation, or in French, that "You will not replace us." That might ring some bells because that was what was chanted at the Unite the Right rally in 2017 in Charlottesville. But nonetheless, this thread is the one I want to underscore. This fear of white extinction and fears of demographic change really characterized both eras. That was often represented with classifications of groups, with cartographical representations. And then you can see on the bottom, the multiculturalism is genocide, is really, that is a common, that must be probably from the UK. I don't actually know exactly where that's from, but it captures the sentiment that is not just in the US, but as part of a global phenomenon of the rise of the far right and white nationalism, where multiculturalism, refugees, immigration are seen as a threat to white heritage and to European heritage. So we don't have to, we can spend just a few minutes looking at particularly media sources on the far right to see the ways in which this demography as destiny, and in this instance, unwanted destiny, is articulated over and over again by pundits. So some of you may remember that in 2018, Laura Ingraham on her Fox News show said, quote, "The America we know and love doesn't exist anymore. Massive demographic changes have been foisted on the American people, and they are changes that none of us ever voted for and most of us don't like." And then connecting that to legal and supposedly to illegal and legal immigration, and throwing in a photo of Alejandra Ocasio-Cortez, just to kind of continue to demonize her and to connect her to the left. This kind of framing from Laura Ingraham reverberates throughout kind of the far right social media sphere, and much of the kind of ideological work that we see coming out of these groups and these ideas, and was, as we know, emblematic of the Trump administration. Connected to this is a fixation on the census. And I think that this is a really interesting theme to track over time. We know that the 1921 and the 1924 bills were always used the census as anchors, whether it was the 1920 census for the initial 1921 legislation or the 1890 census for the final 1924 bill. And it was tracked to the census because the census was seen as a way of both gathering information about the population and who constituted the body politique, and using that as a tool to control it for the future. And this fixation on the census is something that you find over and over again among white nationalists today, with statements such as by 2045, white Europeans will be just 49% of the population. This is replacement migration. This is white genocide. So there is this demographic time clock that is ticking for white nationalists, which is leading up to this point of no return in 2045, 2050, when we will have changed in the United States to be, an ethno-racial pluralistic nation, a nation in which there is no longer a white majority. And so this fuels anxieties, and this fuels a constant fixation with demography. It also helps to explain the contestation over the census, and the way in which the census itself has been wrapped up in, obviously in counting, but in battles over immigration and the kind of us versus them dynamics. So, in its kind of extremist versions, the census, is seen by someone like Albert Johnson, who Linda was talking about, or by Harry Laughlin, who I'll talk about in a minute, as a tool to represent, but more directly to surveil and to erase. So if we were to go back to the early 20th century, to 1921, 1924, when Harry Laughlin, who was the superintendent of the Eugenics Records Office, was named the eugenics expert for the US Congress in collaboration with his work with both Albert Johnson and with the Congressman Box, who worked together on the Johnson-Reed Act and to come up with the origin quotas and so on, you'll find again and again this fixation on the census. And this, in fact, is a image that is taken from Harry Laughlin's papers, which are in Kirksville, Missouri. There are many, many files that are all about using the census to essentially create a eugenic registry of the nation that would capture racial origin, ancestry, as well as, in his ideal world, it would have even more than this, but this is what he put in this one version, moralistic and biological characteristics. And the idea behind this is that with a well-calibrated eugenic census registry, population can be controlled more directly in racial and other terms. As we know, this, and I was mentioning before, the census and determinations about the actual quotas, the quotas that were established in 1924 were based on census numbers from 1890. And if you read some of the recent literature of white nationalists, there is a fixation on looking back at the glory days of the US in the 1950s, when the white population, due to a variety of trends, including first the fact that immigration had shut down for several decades, and also the categories of whiteness and who was included as white had changed. But nonetheless, what you find is an ongoing focus on looking at census numbers and census categories and seeking to reverse things in lines that are sympathetic with them. As I was just mentioning before, one of the broad dynamics, so if we see kind of a continuous thread among what we can call white nationalists and white nationalist eugenicists from the 1920s to the present, we find this fixation on categories, on the census, and ongoing demographic anxieties. At the same time, there was a significant shift in definitions of whiteness and who was classified as white. And many of you are quite familiar with the excellent literature that's been done on how the Irish became white, how the Italians were let into the broader tent of whiteness, and so on. And so those categories from before that so fixated Madison Grant, Nordic, Alpine, Mediterranean, receded and kind of became bundled into this larger category of whiteness. At the same time, and I include this 23andMe to just show how all of these categories came amalgamated into European, and the whole role of genetics in this, which is something else that I have looked at, is an important part of the story that I don't have time for to talk about today. But nonetheless, if that is a shift, what we have seen as a constant is the continual portrayal and demonization of Latinx, particularly Mexicans and Central Americans, and Asians as perpetual foreigners. I have two images here. One is on the Build the Wall was actually a protest that was, or a kind of a protest or an event that was staged by a group that has since folded called Identity Europa, which was an attempt at building an identitarian movement in the United States. They did a lot of these flash mobs and actions where they would appear. In this case, they're at the Mexican consulate in New York City, and they appeared and pulled out their letters and build the wall and so on. And so that reflects kind of this obviously echoing Trump's calls to build the wall. And at the same time, over the past year, we've seen, increasing anti-Asian violence in the context of COVID, and really, very disturbing and concerning trends. And so that is part of this continuous thread where, the categories of whiteness might have been expanded, but Asians and Mexicans have often remained outside of its boundaries. With that, I will stop, and I look forward to your questions. And I just want to say one last thing, which is that it's been interesting to me how often we have mentioned Michigan. Hold on. I actually stuck to time, so I'm very proud of myself. But it's very interesting how we have every speaker has mentioned Michigan or Detroit in some way. And I've been thinking a lot about what has been going on in the state where I live, where we had militia groups seeking to overthrow, to assassinate and kill our governor, and really, an intensification of the militia activity that was already in the state. So I don't know, there's something going on in Michigan. I don't know if I want to know what it is, but I live here, so I probably should. And with that, I will hand it over to Erika.
Thank you, Alex. Maybe we can figure out what is going on in Michigan as part of the larger conversation. I realized that I was a bit remiss at the very beginning of our panel. I should have mentioned that these papers that have just been expertly presented this afternoon have come out of a workshop that the Immigration History Research Center, which I direct at the University of Minnesota, sponsored along with Professor Maddalena Marinari, and with other papers examining the roots and consequences of the 1921 and 1924 Immigration Acts. We have a partner panel of other authors who will be presenting at this year's OAH in April, as well as a plan for these papers to be part of a special issue of the Journal of American History. So first of all, there are a number of questions that are coming in, and I encourage any of you who still have questions and want to put them into the Q&A function to start doing that now. But I thought I would start with first a comment and then move my way into a question. But I wanted to express my appreciation for the way in which Linda ended her paper and the theme that she had throughout, in terms of showing us and encouraging us to think about how law is not just an expression of public opinion, but how it also validates and produces public opinion, that it's not just an effect of bigotry, but then furthers bigotry. And so the first question is sort of a takeoff on that idea, to ask whether, I guess in particular, let's start with Ashley, whether that framework can be used to help us understand the ongoing consequences of some of the research that you focused on. So for example, can the militarization of the border in the surveillance of undocumented immigration, can it be seen as a force for an expansion of militarization more generally in the United States? Can we see the ways in which masculinity was identified at the border as not just a reflection of what's happening in the interior of the United States, but actually a force pushing for the solidification of gender roles or gender identities beyond the border? So just to start off with trying to make one of these connections between these fabulous papers.
Yes, thank you so much, Erika. And I think absolutely. I think that I was thinking about Linda's point as well as she was finishing there, and thinking about how the law is so integral in not just kind of ending the story on immigration and kind of tying things up, but creating new problems and new categories, and perpetuating a lot of further xenophobia and things. I think a lot of kind of research kind of often thinks of the 1924 Immigration Act as this culmination of xenophobia, nativism, and then kind of shifts further. But I really appreciate that so many scholars now are looking at how this continued, perpetuated, changed after 1924. And I think the militarization has a lot to do with this. I think that, yes, a lot of the fact that the people on the border, in many people who kind of had xenophobic or bigoted ideas on the border, maybe in Detroit, Michigan, in some cases, often felt legitimized by new laws, felt legitimized by the presence of a border patrol, particularly of a very masculine force that's talking about how they're going to wield state power, and they're talking about protection of American citizens. And this continues then into local police forces who are protecting American citizens against labor agitators or things like that. So it kind of becomes part of the discourse beyond the border. So this kind of militarized border is important because it sets a precedent for militarizing so many other parts of American society after this. I think.
Great, thank you. We have a number of questions that coincide and sort of merge with one of the questions that I had also wanted to ask. And that is, I think both Alex and Linda give us a hint at what happens beyond the 20s. Alex jumps us to the present day. Linda hints at what happens to the Klan in the 1930s. So I have one question that'll merge with some of the others that are being asked in the Q&A, and that is to help us get from 1924 to 1965. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act abolished discrimination in immigration law. It abolished the national origins quotas. It is known within our field as one of the major civil rights laws of its period. There has been a lot of scholarship recently to reassess just how equitable the law was, but it still has a certain place in our historiography and in our American society in recognizing that it did reopen the United States to immigration after 65. So how do we, if you could take your specific main actors, so expand on the KKK, expand on what's happening with those border officials at the northern border. Alex, you did hint at the shifting and expanding definitions of whiteness, but to help us get to where in 1965, we do have the beginnings of what Matthew Fry Jacobson called Ellis Island whiteness. We have the celebration of the very people that the eugenicists had had focused their animosity on. And just more specifically, more specifically to that is a question for Linda, specifically from Linda Kerber, who asks, what lines of connection might be drawn between your observation about the decline of anti-Catholic sentiment and, as David Nassau has made clear in The Last Million, the extraordinary power of Catholic lobbyists by the end of World War II, to ensure that by far the large majority of displaced persons who enter the United States are Catholic, generally from the Baltic region, especially from Ukraine, even if they have collaborated with Nazis, and simultaneously firmly excluding Jews who have lingered in DP camps. So I don't know, Linda, if you want to think about that just a little bit, or if you might be ready to answer. But I welcome Alex, Ashley, anyone to think about more broadly, how do we get from 24 to 65 embedded in this shifting definitions of whiteness, in particular, sort of the further decline of anti-Catholicism, but the perpetual foreignness of Latinx, Asians, and the endurance of anti-Semitism in this period, and certainly continuing to today.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer Linda Kerber's really good question, but and the first thing I want to say is a more just kind of typical scholarly thing. We really do not have good history of the American fascist groups of the 1930s. We've got a couple of really good studies of Father Coughlin. It's really difficult to talk about them because there's so many of them, just like it is about white nationalism today. But the usual narrative is that these groups arose, but then as soon as we had a war, Americans saw that the Nazis and the fascists were evil, and that took us to another place. I think that's too simple. And clearly and Alex would probably say much more about this, clearly there's got to be some direct connection or indirect connection between the what went on in the 30s and white nationalists today. It also raises a whole other issue that I've been trying to work on, in which I really only have a criticism to say. That is the question, what do we mean by fascism? And today, there is so much publication theory, international, trying to talk about the definition of fascism once you get into it. And being a historian, and I'm more accustomed to empirical work rather than theory, I think that's the wrong question to ask. One of the things I written, I love this quote by Umberto Eco that says something like, fascism will always wear the clothing of the place where it arises. So I think we need to study these groups, but without focusing too much on what's the definition of fascism, by looking at just exactly what they did do and what they didn't do, and how that carried through. I realize it's not an adequate answer, especially about the decline of anti-Catholicism, which hasn't completely declined, but I'm sure most historians know that it was raised when John Kennedy was running for president in 1960. But by then it really was a marginal view. And now we have a Supreme Court that is mostly Catholic. What that means is complicated. It may have to do with the absolutely conservative Catholic Church, but it doesn't tell us much about the actual people who are Catholics.
Thanks. I'm not going to delve into the big debate about fascism and neo-fascism today, although I think that is a really important debate in terms of definitions and what does it mean, and particularly in the context of both what is a global kind of far right, very global far right, and a very localized expressions of it, as you were alluding to, Linda. In terms of, I'm going to tackle one part of the question, which is the role of 1965. And particularly just as I was looking at the longevity and the kind of repurposing of Madison Grant in the context of 2016, white nationalists today refer regularly to the 1965 Act. And why do they do that? Well, for them, it is an inflection point when things, from their perspective, really started to go downhill for the United States, because immigration patterns began to change, and the demography is destiny argument that they are projecting into 2045, 2050, from their perspective, started in 1965 with the shift in immigration policy. And another really important part of that, so it's caught up in the nostalgia that white nationalists have for 1940s and 1950s America. In addition, the negative narratives about 1965 are also very much caught up in anti-Semitism. So if you want to look at some of the seeds for contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism, you can trace them back to blame that was placed on the Jews in particular for what white nationalists see as manipulation of immigration laws in Jewish self-interest to shift towards a more multicultural society. They actually read a lot more intentionality into the actors than they might have had at the time. But nonetheless, that kind of heaping on of blame, for Jewish actors engaging in a conspiracy, pulling the levers of immigration law to their benefit so that they would know how to kind of play groups off one another, and to situate themselves vis-a-vis potential immigrants from Latin America and Asia, as well as this more amalgamated kind of category of kind of whiteness. So from my perspective, to understand these stepping stones that I was talking about at the beginning, 1965 is a very important conceptual stepping stone for white nationalists today. And you can't really understand the way in which their xenophobia is tied up with anti-Semitism without looking at how they're taking that on, and their particular, their kind of demonization of the Hart-Celler Act.
Can I just say one more thing that just occurred to me because of what you're saying, Alex, if this is okay, and that is, this notion that World War II turned things around and made us understand the importance of the strength of a diverse nation. But the story about what happened to the Jews in World War II is just absolutely appalling. I mean, the fact is that the United States government was directly responsible for some of the millions who died because of the immigration policy. So the idea that anti-Semitism had gone away was really or the idea that because the Nazis did such a thing with anti-Semitism that it declined here is really, I think, needs more examination.
Right. Thank you, Linda. I agree that this kind of focus on the war as this moment when things started to change and Americans suddenly saw that some sort of pluralistic nation is really kind of not quite right. But I do want to point to the fact that in post-war America, we do see, coming out of post-war America, we see a political project that is being undertaken by interfaith activists, government officials, cultural elites that do start to promote cultural pluralism in a new way. I'm thinking about work by, say, Wendy Wall, or recent work by Maddalena Marinari that talks about how particularly Italians and Jews focus so much on trying to kind of destabilize immigration quotas and pass the 1965 Immigration Act. So it's less this wartime project and more this these groups kind of getting things together and coming to the fore and creating this alternate narrative. So maybe it's that the white nationalism never goes away, but other groups start to kind of take on this mantle of defining what America is in some ways. And I see this. So there's this huge focus in the 1920s, policing-wise, on the northern border and on policing Europeans, policing these groups that Alex and Linda has shown were shown as undesirable, unfit for American citizenship. But this, of course, shifts during World War II by the late 1930s into the 1940s. The focus on policing is almost exclusively on the southern border. So we see the focus is on Latinx people almost exclusively as well. So, and it's very sudden. I mean, it's not sudden, but it happens in a way that's surprising. In the archive, you'll see huge files on Detroit and Buffalo and these border towns, and then suddenly they're very small, and the files on places like El Paso and San Antonio are what take up the largest space in the archive and the space in the INS papers and things. So just the focus from the organization itself changes. But these things that happen on the northern border, the focus on policing, on gender, they do transfer to the southern border in some ways, in the fact that the same people, in many cases, Border Patrol agents, the semi-military organization, they're transferred from the northern border to the southern border in many cases. So the same people who have kind of started in the north and policing in Detroit and on the St. Lawrence Waterway are suddenly show up in El Paso, and they're trying to figure out and put their own racial discourses that they've developed by policing Italians and Polish people in these cities to policing largely Latinx people and sometimes Asians in these areas as well. So we do see this shift that happens in this post-war period. I think it's really important to think about it and think about changing some of these narratives. Absolutely.
There are a number of questions that, unsurprisingly, are asking us about contemporary policies, including the ongoing debate over immigration, the strength of white supremacy as seen on the assault on the Capitol. So I'm going to merge a few questions together, and then I think because we're at 2:21, I'll ask, I think this will be the last set of questions in order to allow each one of you to answer. So obviously we are gathering here. You all have been writing on these topics during, as historians are already showing, not historians of the future, but as we are already showing, a period of restriction that matches and may even surpass the era of restriction of the 1920s. A recent report has shown that under the Trump administration, there were over 1,060 immigration regulations and policies that were put into place, and that it's probably quite unrealistic that the Biden administration will be able to reverse all of them. So I want to ask a question about process, which is how has writing in this time period, or did it, change the ways in which you were asking questions, searching for new sources, coming to new conclusions? And then a question from the audience, from Kimberly Enderly. What do you all make of President Biden's memorandum condemning and combating racism and xenophobia, given the systemic nature of these systems in the United States and the recent assault on the US Capitol? So one question about process, and then basically what do we think about the Biden administration's attempts so far, and any other suggestions that we may have to try to combat xenophobia and racism today.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing. I don't know that I'm gonna again be able to get to the answer of that, but I got into studying the Klan because I was writing a book about social movements. And I wanted to look at the Klan about social movements and as a social movement. And so I had to say, well, what do people get from this? Why are they there? Because I think one of the hidden secrets of many social movements is that people active in them often have a lot of fun. They're enjoyable. I find the discourse today about the white nationalists, and I can understand it because it's pretty horrifying, and we have reason to be terribly, terribly worried about it. But I wonder if it would be helpful to have, again, a little more looking at this about what are these people getting from it? How does it feel to be a part of one of these groups, and what are the rewards? Obviously, I don't want to defer us from talking about the impact of their ideas and of their violence. But I do think that there's a certain kind of sense of lack in what I read about it in terms of the granular experience of being a part of one of these groups.
I was going to respond to the part of the question about process and just say that in writing my most recent book, I didn't go to any archives in the kind of typical fashion that we might think about archives, where you go to a repository and Ashley, you were describing the records that you looked at and the changing size of the files in the Border Patrol records. And, my previous research had engaged paper archives, often, in substantial form. And to write this book involved really everything was either existed digitally or a lot of it was born digitally. And because of the ephemeral nature of social media, a lot of it was basically, I created snapshots of it and have really created and curated my own archive based on far right and white nationalist kind of content production, we can call it, in the 2010s. One of the things that is striking is if I look at the bibliography for my book, half of those links are no longer valid. I mean, they're dead because people have been deplatformed, because they have shifted to other accounts, and just because this is such a shifting, as Erika, I think what's called it, like multi-hydra headed, entity when we look at white nationalism, that, what I really captured was a snapshot in dynamic time by looking at social media, which raises very interesting questions for us as historians going forward too, about how do we think about social media and curated kind of digital sources and as archives, and how are they different and how are they the same? And particularly when they rely so heavily on visual imagery or memes. And a lot of what I have done in this work, and if I had more time, I would deconstruct many more of these memes with you so we could see what they're messaging, and also then think about some of these questions about it. Well, once we understand that, how do we deconstruct or counteract this messaging?
Thank you so much for your responses, and also responding to the question about process, but also thinking about Biden's role and the new administration's role in some of these policies. I think the last administration's immigration policies have made, while I was researching, made it seem, one, more relevant and important, and just really emphasized how much nativism and ethnic bigotry are so clearly not something abstract in the past, right? They're a part of America's politics more than ever. We all know this. And I think it really informed the political project of my research, which was to demonstrate that Europeans are not the quote unquote legal immigrants of the past, that there's this narrative that Europeans waited in line at Ellis Island and came in the right way, that you see a lot of right wing and members of the Trump administration espousing regularly and saying, wait your turn, right? Kind of intimating that their ancestors did that, which is actually not true. Many of the people who are so involved in hardline immigration policies may have had grandparents that paid smugglers to get them into the United States because they weren't deemed desirable by the state. And so today's politics really made me want to revise this narrative. And to the question about whether Biden kind of eschewing xenophobia and denouncing xenophobia is enough. I mean, I don't think so, not at all. I think that Biden needs to create a path to citizenship in the same way that these European immigrants' ancestors were given a path to citizenship in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, if we want to compare their narratives in any way.
Thank you. I think that's a great point. I've as someone who's written on xenophobia, I noted with great relief that the president had issued this proclamation. On the one hand, because it did mark such a vast departure from the previous administration, who had promoted and furthered the China virus and the blame China narrative that has led to a 2,600% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes since the pandemic, including this week. However, it's all about how much these proclamations, memorandums, plans to review policies and executive orders are about the appearance of racial progress as opposed to implementing, institutionalizing, actual change. So this is like, we are at a tipping point that's very similar to the 1960s, when there seems to be a whole lot of public opinion and support for reform, but whether reform translates into equality is going to be the most important question that we need to ask ourselves. I did put in the chat a link to a website that's hosted right now on the Immigration History Research Center site, but it is the beginnings of a collaborative effort that many migration scholars and historians have begun to comment on current Biden administration policies. We've begun by taking those executive orders and then annotating them. And I think there's at least half a dozen on our page right now. So you can check that out. We're also on Twitter where we're putting out these comments, and it's really an attempt of us all to be part of that conversation, because we know the lessons of history and how we have fallen short in previous eras of reform. So I want to thank everybody, all of the panelists and the attendees who have stuck with us till the end for this fabulous conversation, and all of the work by the AHA to organize us, to promote these virtual colloquia, and to end with a wish that we will all be able to get together soon. But thank you again so very much.
Thank you. I'd just like to take us out of our webinar today. A recording will be available on the AHA's YouTube channel in a week or so. You can also find recordings of past virtual AHA sessions on the channel as well. I'd like to thank our generous sponsors again, which were the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions. We're sorry we couldn't get to all of the really fascinating questions that were posed during the limited time we had today. And finally, a special thanks to the panelists. Have a good day. Thank you.